following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. Hello, listeners on Saga 960 AM and those listening around the world on streaming and podcast services. This is It's Not Therapy. I am Leanna Kersner, and I am not a therapist, but I am your source for practical advice for everyday problems using my top 10 sayings for checking in with your best self. Now, last week I had to take an unexpected wellness week. I wasn't feeling well. I was worn out, and I didn't want to take that out on other people. So this episode, we're going to be talking about projection, the mental process by which people attribute to others what is in their own minds. Our guest this episode is relationship expert Dr. Stosny, who will be here later to talk to us about how categorical explanations and projections lead to self-fulfilling prophecies in relationships. Now, defensive projection, the one we hear the most often about, is a process of displacing feelings in us that are too painful or scary to keep inside. Now, some people take out those feelings on animals or objects instead of other people, but it's all the same general motivation. People see their own worst qualities or deepest fears reflected in people or things outside themselves, and they often lash out. People project to avoid looking at what's really going on inside them. It's just too hard to feel their feelings and own them, so they blame someone else, usually a person close to them. It's obvious why this can damage relationships and undermine trust, but the truth is, every human being does it to a greater or lesser degree. It takes active, conscious work to minimize defensive projections. The thing about that work is it's hard. It's a constant struggle, but it's worth it. Now, people also project good things onto other people, and we don't talk about this as much because that's not seen as a thing, certainly not seen as a problem. It's good to see the good in people, right? Yeah, it's good to see the actual good in people. Emphasis on it needs to actually be in them, not projected onto them. Positive projections, misused, can make you a lousy judge of character and prone to manipulation. When you see your own positive traits reflected in someone because of common interests or background, you can miss warning signs, which is why I say, top 10 phrase, core values are more important to relationships than common interests. Here's an example. I like Star Wars, really like Star Wars. Just because I like Star Wars and someone else likes Star Wars, that doesn't mean that other person is a good person. They might be one of those people that think Anakin Skywalker did nothing wrong. I've met people like that. Yikes. Just because someone grew up in the same neighborhood, belongs to the same religion, or votes the same way you do, does not mean they're automatically a good person. Their relationship to that common interest may not be based on the same core values. Now, positive projections can be used to encourage and motivate others to do better. It's just important to make sure that we're not relying on positive qualities in others that aren't actually there. Make sense? So projection, positive and negative, something to watch. Can't get rid of it entirely. It has its place, but we want to keep it in healthy bounds. And more than one of my top 10 phrases involves minimizing defensive projections, those negative ones that are, this feels bad, fling it at someone else. I've already mentioned the one about core values. But we also have, don't let problems that aren't your fault lead to mistakes that are. Self-esteem cannot exist without self-compassion. Perfect is a lie. Stop trying to be perfect. And be the hero of your own story and not anyone else's. These tips combined can really help with that urge to project. You can't help feeling frightened or attacked. That's not your fault. You can communicate those negative feelings without making accusations. Communicating feelings as accusations is how those problems turn into mistakes. There are ways of dealing with the problem of bad feelings without engaging in the mistake of projection. It's the whole, I'm not scared, you're scared, when you're totally scared. That deal. What's so terrible about being scared? Answer that question before you react. It might be useful. If you're in an environment where your feelings are weaponized against you and that's why you can't admit them, maybe getting out of that environment is something to consider. Adding toxicity to an already toxic environment doesn't help anyone. Actions that add to the existing problem are mistakes, and many of these mistakes are preventable. Now, it's hard to make those logical changes when you can't live with big parts of yourself. Projection tends to be a symptom of an inability to really look at our own motivations and behaviors. When we beat ourselves up, everything seems more difficult and catastrophic. When we're gentle with ourselves, when we treat ourselves with compassion, it's much easier to admit we're feeling vulnerable. It's easier to admit mistakes. Healthy self-esteem is the key to reducing defensive projection. And healthy self-esteem is based on self-compassion. Because eventually, every one of us is going to have bad moments. We're going to make mistakes. That's inevitable. Nobody's perfect. Perfect is a lie. I repeat, perfect is a lie. But so many of us deflect and project because we think that quirks and imperfections are weakness instead of the things that make us unique individuals. So instead of admitting the weakness to ourselves, we throw them back at the world because they feel just too awful. So any standard that relies on perfection likely won't lead to good results. Because perfection in human interactions is just simply impossible. Perfect is a lie. Stop trying to be perfect. Get comfortable with the fact that you're not going to be perfect because no one is. It's the only way to ever truly feel comfortable in your own skin. Stop trying to be perfect. And that brings me to being the hero of your own story and not anyone else's. That and not anyone else's is the part that a lot of people struggle with, even when they get the be the hero of your own story part. When we project onto other people, we're taking our story and forcing it onto someone else. And that's likely not what you're consciously intending to do. But it's the most likely outcome when you're trying to escape a feeling or urge you have that you find too hard to face. People don't like feeling like secondary characters in their own lives. They don't like being told what they're thinking and feeling, especially if you're wrong. No matter how strong the urge is, it's a bad idea to tell other people what their internal experiences are. The only thing you can say for certain about another person is what you're observing. You cannot be certain what they're truly feeling. So address another person's behavior. Don't try to psychoanalyze their inner workings. This show is called It's Not Therapy for a reason, right? And that brings me to one of the listener questions for this episode. It involves when therapists project, but it's kind of a long answer. So we're going to take a break before I get into it. You're not going to want to miss this. If you have a question, you can give me a call at 289-275-9600. That's 289-275-9600. Or you can email me. I prefer email because I can dig right into every word. Liana@nottherapyshow.com. That's Lian as in Nancy A at nottherapyshow.com. Or Twitter, Instagram @nottherapyshow. We'll be back in a bit on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy talking projection. And in this segment, we're dealing with what happens when therapists project onto their clients. This question is from a listener. And again, if you want to ask a question, 289-275-9600. That's 289-275-9600. Email me at liana@nottherapyshow.com, LIANA@nottherapyshow.com, or Twitter, Instagram @nottherapyshow. The questioner, who did not want to give a name, asks, "Hi, Liana. I've had some bad experiences with the mental health system. Notably, I've had more than one therapist project their personal insecurities onto me or someone else in group therapy, and it led to a lot of anxiety and hurt feelings. Why do these professionals with training do this?" Thanks for your question, listener. The short, unsatisfying answer is because they're human and we all do it sometimes. The longer answer is that the nature of a therapist's job requires them to hug that fine line between diagnosing and projecting. This is why I stay outside the conventional therapy system. I think I can offer more as an add-on to it because of my own personal experiences with the system. Therapy deals with underlying causes of behavior as well as behaviors you want to change themselves. And in medical systems that require affirmative diagnosis to prove to an insurance company that a particular treatment is medically necessary, this can lead to professionals just getting it wrong in sort of a haste makes waste paradigm, right? In physical medicine, there's often an affirmative test, a blood test, a urine test, something, to tell you what disease you have, right? We're all familiar with those COVID tests by now. You may know someone with diabetes, right? You check your blood sugar, that kind of stuff. With mental health conditions, diagnostics are often checklists of criteria, checklists of symptoms of behaviors. And if you display more than a minimum number of behaviors, the therapist determines you have clinical anxiety, chronic depression, some other mood disorder, or a personality disorder, so on and so forth, right? But there's a lot of overlap in those symptoms and what they mean. So the first diagnosis a person receives in terms of mental health stuff is often not the most correct one. And consciously, we know this. We know this is a challenge in the system, in this whole thing. And yet I've heard so many stories from clients about therapists that lean hard on that first diagnosis instead of continuing to observe the client for other cues. A particular favorite that I hear over and over and over again is some event or condition explaining everything a person does. You know, of course he did that. He's an addict. Or he just doesn't remember he's an addict. Or you have no control. You're an addict, right? Addiction's a big one. But then there's things like, she can't be expected to do this. She has autism, right? This could be true. Could be. And a lot of times it is, but it's not necessarily true. Then there's a situation where the therapist's past bad experience come into play. For instance, if a therapist were at the mercy of, say, a narcissist, that therapist may be too quick to label another person as a narcissist. Now, labels of narcissism seem to be especially trendy these days, and I work with more than one client who got labeled a narcissist by a therapist, even though they don't come close to fitting the real criteria. Someone with PTSD, for instance, can seem extremely self-involved, especially complex PTSD. But that doesn't mean that that person is disregarding the feelings of other people, which is an essential thing in the narcissist label, right? But a therapist with danger alerts that are highly attuned to narcissistic traits because of dealings with a narcissist in their past might not consider those other possibilities because of very human panic and that sense of self-preservation that all of us have or should have. It's good to have a sense of self-preservation as long as we keep it proactive and useful, as opposed to cutting us off from things, we could benefit from. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of information and a huge amount of active listening to truly understand what's behind an attitude or behavior that's not helping someone live their best life. That's why I say listen twice before you talk once. In situations where I'm trying to, work with somebody new for the first time, I often listen 4 or 5 times before I talk once, for reasons. But that time, the way I work, that kind of labor, well, in our government-funded or private insurance-funded mental health systems, well, that kind of time and effort costs money. And we all know we live in a society obsessed with efficiencies. So that means, questioner, it's not just a therapist having a blind spot. There's a financial incentive for an intake therapist to rush a diagnosis to get a person into something, anything that can start to get them help. Now, the problem with this, as well-meaning as it is, just get them into a program, get them something, get them some sort of intervention as quick as possible, is that a diagnosis is a label. And that label changes the assumptions people have about the person who's been labeled. I'm very open about my own PTSD diagnosis because I want to reduce some of the stigma surrounding that condition. But I'm well aware that many people are either afraid of people with PTSD, especially military veterans with PTSD, or they look down on us, some kind of broken people. Now, the truth is that I'm more resilient than the average person. I've got a better read and understanding of my reactions, and I'm saying this not to be arrogant. I've put a lot of work into getting to this point. This has been almost a decade-long journey for me at this point. And in that journey, I've gotten very used to people projecting their own stuff onto me, and it becomes more frequent when they're aware of that diagnosis. PTSD, oh, this means you're all these things, right? So I know firsthand that too often people dismiss the perspectives of those diagnosed with psychiatric conditions because the diagnosed person is sick, right? Here's the thing. The best, fastest way I know of to make a crazy person feel more bad crazy is to gaslight them. This is why I say your crazy is only a problem if it's hurting you. I want to reclaim the word crazy. Unfortunately, even mental health professionals accidentally or somewhat deliberately gaslight people seeking help at times. It's due to incorrect assumptions, and they think, they're going to get tough on someone for their own good, when they don't know them well enough to know what their own good is. An additional problem with this whole therapeutic system that causes therapists to project onto clients is, until very recently, certain psychiatric conditions were considered untreatable. And many training programs still discourage therapists and outreach workers from working with those with certain conditions. I'm not going to say what they are specifically because I don't want to freak anybody out or scare anyone. And while it's true that some of the personality disorders require specialized approaches, I mean, any mental health condition exists, the diagnosis exists to tailor a specialized approach. Some of those personality disorders require a certain type of person with certain type of skills. You know, especially dealing with those true narcissists that struggle to recognize that the problem actually is them. Now, in those cases, they're unlikely to seek help in the first place. But even for them, even for people with a tough to treat condition, the two biggest predictors of success in treatment, in my experience, are wanting better for yourself and feeling like you can get better. If you want better and feel like that's possible, you can succeed. Of course, then there's the variable of whether you feel like you deserve better. And that's a big part of it too. And often when somebody gets labeled via a diagnosis, it can feel like something of a death sentence. It can make a person who's already down feel like a burden. It's this big, scary thing. They don't feel like they're worth the investment of other people's time and efforts and money and, emotional support. There's a lot of trial and error in the process of mental wellness. You have to try different things on and see how they fit. So this is very important to the person who asked this question and everyone listening. If a therapist ever says something to you that feels off, trust that feeling. Now, hard truths hurt. Trust me. They hurt. But hard truths, things that sting because they're true, as opposed to things that sting because they're not true, well, those are different hurts. Someone projecting something onto you that isn't true is a particular hurt, and you'll know it when you feel it. Trust that feeling, Star Wars. Seriously, trust your gut on those things. This is your life. This is your brain. These are your feelings. If something feels off regarding your feelings, then it's off. And just because somebody has a degree and certification doesn't change that. Now, this is where things get complex because changing your thinking and circumstances for the better is hard. There's a denial process. There's a grieving process as you give up your old self for a better one. And then there's the fact that a lot of people around you will try to keep you stuck. They'll call you a lot of nasty things because when a person changes, well, that reduces certainty in the people around them. And people's brains crave certainty. So it's a process and it can be tough sometimes, but there's a difference between it being tough and feeling tough and it feeling wrong. So hopefully that answers your question, person who wrote in and didn't want to be identified, and also gives you a little bit of support in coming back from therapists projecting onto you, because that can be a very re-traumatizing thing. But don't take my word for it about change reducing certainty, people's brains craving certainty. I brought in an expert for this. This week's guest, Dr. Stosny, relationship expert, is going to be here to talk to me about just that topic for the interview after this break. And questioner, I'm so sorry about the bad experiences you've had. Thanks so much for your question. If anyone out there wants to ask me a question like this listener did, 289-275-9600, 289-275-9600, Leanna at nottherapyshow.com, Lian is in Nancy A at nottherapyshow.com, at nottherapyshow on Twitter and Instagram. When we come back, projections, explanations, and self-fulfilling prophecies with relationship expert Dr. Stosny on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. And we're back after the break on It's Not Therapy. And that means it's time for the It's Not Therapy interview. This interview, I have relationship expert Dr. Stephen Stosny with me. And I discovered an article in Psychology Today that Stephen wrote about explanations and how explanations can end up as self-fulfilling prophecies and actually get in the way of healthy relationships. So, Stephen, thanks for being on the show, first of all.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah. Now, why did you write the article? What is a bad explanation and how can it impact negatively your relationships?
Well, explanations give meaning to experience. They organize experience and memories, and that's their function. It's not to find truth. They don't have to be accurate. They just have to be coherent. Brain research tells us that the brain's constantly trying to have coherent stories about our experience and our lives, our memories. And explanations are just one of the ways of doing that. They just have to organize. They don't have to be right. And the reason for that is explanations reduce anxiety. The more we understand something or seem to understand something, the less anxiety we have. What is more terrifying than, my God, why is this happening to me? So we develop all kinds of explanations to explain why they're happening to me, and that reduces anxiety, even if it's a bad explanation. In other words, I'd rather feel like I feel bad because I'm a loser or I'm married to a loser than not know why I feel that way. So it's just a way of being able to predict your experience and control anxiety.
You see a lot of people doing that, right? Saying, what good does saying I'm a loser do other than sort of tame the chaos? And yet I find it stops people from taking the healthy risks, and they miss opportunities because they've given themselves what you call a categorical explanation, correct?
Yeah, that's right. The explanation limits growth. You want explanations that promote growth. See, the brain's a short-term emotion regulation organism. So once you reduce that anxiety at the moment, even if the explanation produces a lot more long-term anxiety, like identifying yourself as a loser would do. So you can't allow that autopilot explanation to go untested. And the way you test any explanation is to consciously consider evidence against it. Because in autopilot, we have confirmation bias. You're only going to consider evidence that supports it. So if I'm a loser, then I have to start thinking of all the times I've succeeded. And that will modify the explanation. If I'm married to a loser, I have to think of all the wonderful things she's done over the years, and that will modify that explanation. But it won't happen on autopilot. You have to consciously do it.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And there's so much in the media and listening to other people that are almost training us into antisocial behavior that way. The number of things we see talking about some categorical group and innate qualities in that group that aren't necessarily so. And people seem to be making more and more judgments based on those categories. The example you gave is, in the article, men are more aggressive than women. Right. And you broke this down. Yes. If you selectively, if you take a random selection, on the whole, it's more likely to be, but that causes us to miss details of the individual. And I find it leads to massive misunderstandings and a lot of hurt feelings. So how do you balance these, research? We sort of have turned science into a religion in this way, haven't we? That research is everything and personal observation, well, if you don't have science to back it up, people see it as not real in some cases. So, how do you balance your own observations in dealing with the individual while not ignoring these, scientific studies?
Well, scientific studies are always about group averages, not individuals.
Hmm.
For instance, that random selection of 50 men and 50 women will have more aggressive behaviors in the male group, but there's going to be lots of aggressive women in the one group and non-aggressive men in the other. So
Hmm.
when you judge individuals by group findings, it becomes more of a stereotype than an actual scientific finding. So we have to deal with individuals, not with whole groups of people.
Yeah, and that's where we lead to what you say is a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's almost a confirmation bias, right? If you're attuned to certain behaviors in a person, if you're expecting them, you're more likely to jump on them when you see them. Did I get that connection right?
Yeah, and it's worse in intimate relationships because they activate a lot of projective identification. That's when you make projections onto someone like, oh, you're a man, so you must be aggressive.
Right.
And then the other person will start to identify with the projection and start being more aggressive. Projective identification is a hidden dynamic in close relationships, but it's a very powerful one. What I tell my clients to do uh, to use projective identification for their advantage is project qualities you would like to see more of your partner. Instead of saying your partner's narcissistic, just
Hmm.
think, don't say it, just think. My partner's very compassionate. And if you see behavior that contradicts that, that's uncharacteristic. There's something wrong, and then you'll
Right.
be concerned. And what I tell people to do is test that hypothesis for 3 weeks, and you should notice your partner will be more compassionate. Well, you mentioned before about there's a lot more judgment now. It's because the world is so complex.
Hmm.
Uh, what I've noticed just in the 40 years that I practice was that the more complex the world gets, the more categorical we get, the less tolerant of ambiguity. But we live in a very ambiguous and uncertain world, and explanations are a way to make it unambiguous and more certain. But that's an illusion of certainty. We have to be able to embrace ambiguity and uncertainty because uncertainty actually motivates you to learn, that motivates you to grow, where
Yeah.
explanations tend to inhibit growth.
There's the issue of what you actually think versus how you come across as well. And I loved the part in your article about people sort of labeling someone, especially regarding personality disorders or other mental health conditions. And then they knowingly or not take on this role of superiority. How does someone check that in themselves? And how do they receive the feedback that they're doing it? Because that's a tough thing to hear if you're not doing it intentionally.
No, you're not doing it intentionally. I always ask people to test the hypothesis. Form this hypothesis that your partner is not a personality disorder, that they're just dealing with their emotions through blame, denial, and avoidance. And
Mhm.
that's the emotion regulation technique of all the personality disorders is either blame, denial, or avoidance.
Mhm.
And we begin doing that at age 2. Uh, if you look at it that way, then you can correct each behavior or have a chance of correcting each behavior. But when you make it about the personality, there's no correction. And people don't like to be diagnosed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you ever diagnose someone and they said, oh, well, thank God I am enlightened now because you pointed out this diagnosis? No, they don't do that. They get defensive and angry. And then that proves your diagnosis because
Right.
they're reacting to you.
Right. And yet so many people do that. So many people transfer their own experiences, the things that help them into places that it doesn't necessarily belong. And then they don't understand why the other person is getting aggressive. The challenge, I think, with this, Stephen, is that so much of this is very instinctual. What are your tips for overcoming this, chicken and the egg issue when it comes to, explanations and self-fulfilling prophecies?
Well, first of all, you have to accept that meaning is not in nature. It's created by the human brain.
Mm-hmm.
And explanations are a way of creating meaning. So you're in control of them. You can choose the explanations of your experience, and you want to choose the ones that give you the most growth and well-being, as long as they're plausible. They have to be
Mm-hmm.
you can't live in a fantasy world. But almost every explanation has a alternative explanations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. One person with an absolutely terrible childhood can grow up to be perfectly well adjusted. Somebody else, not so much. There's always more to it than a single cause.
Right. And even adverse childhood experience, there's strong correlations of that with adult problems.
Right.
But it's only a little over half of the people, if you look at the correlation. Or
Yeah.
see, that's another thing about psychological research. They're all moderate to weak
Yeah.
correlations.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's not like physics.
Yeah. And trying to explain to somebody who reads a lot of, articles about scientific papers, it fills that craving for certainty. It makes the world seem ordered. What's something somebody can do, a simple thing, to be more comfortable with not having all the explanations, with the unknown, with not feeling totally in control of your circumstances?
If you have an explanation that is causing you any kind of distress, consciously think of an alternative explanation that's equally plausible. In other words, instead of my partner is narcissistic, my partner is in a habit of blaming. If I if I don't blame my partner is not as likely to blame me. See, the only real chance you have of changing your partner is to change what your partner reacts to.
Right.
But our brains aren't good at doing that. We are hypersensitive to people's reactions, but
Mm-hmm.
hardly sensitive at all to what they're reacting to. That's what we're doing.
Right.
The brain has this high stake about recording injury we suffer, but
Mm-hmm.
not injury that we inflict. For instance, if you have an argument with your partner, the next day you will recall the worst thing that your partner said in that argument, but you won't recall what you said immediately before it.
Yeah. Yeah. Because that wasn't the pain point.
Right, that didn't get encoded in long-term memory. There's even research now that shows that in an emotional discussion, the what the other person's saying is going into memory, and what you're saying is not.
Yeah. Yeah. And that causes, even if you have a tape recorder rolling, it doesn't solve the problem of miscommunication there, because it can only record what was said, not the motivations or what was being felt that led to that statement. So, what do people do? How's the best way to test an explanation without it becoming confirmation bias or a self-fulfilling prophecy?
Well, you can never get rid of bias completely. You can
Right,
only read, because our brains just are biased by
right.
nature. But you can reduce it, and the way you reduce it is to bring it into your reflective brain that can consider alternative evidence. The autopilot brain can't do that. It's only got one explanation.
Right.
But the reflective brain can entertain multiple explanations. We're just in the habit of choosing, of verifying the autopilot brain, where we can always choose another one.
So it sounds like what you're saying is the best thing to do is slow everything down to give that reflective brain time to work.
Right. Daniel Kahneman made that famous thinking fast and slow. The
Right.
autopilot brain is very fast, but the reflective brain, you got to back off a little bit.
Right.
Fairness is a huge example of that. We're
Mm-hmm.
hypersensitive to when other people are unfair,
Mm-hmm.
but we're hardly sensitive at all to when we are. You almost have to go on a weekend retreat to figure out, well, I could have been a little more fair then.
Yeah,
On
it's
autopilot,
definitely
you
a
won't do it.
yeah, it's definitely a conscious exercise trying to figure out where you went wrong as opposed to pointing out all the other ways the other person messed up.
See, in interactions, we have to be able to predict other people's behavior because unpredictable behavior makes anxiety go through the roof.
Right.
And attributions, explanations, and projections are a way of doing that. That's really all it is trying to predict other people's behavior.
Right. And the only thing you can really predict about humans is that they're going to be unpredictable.
Well, they have their own agendas.
Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes those change based on stimulus. All right, Dr. Stephen Stosny, relationship expert. Stephen, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about this. I'm sure you've given people a lot of food for the reflective brain.
Well, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
When we come back on It's Not Therapy, what to do when someone's projecting onto you. The final piece. You guys know I wouldn't leave you hanging on that one, right? Back in a bit. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back in the final moments of this episode of It's Not Therapy. I am Leanna Kersner, and as promised, we're going to look at what to do when people are projecting things onto you. Now, to be clear here, the advice I'm about to give is very difficult to execute. I'm not great at it myself a lot of the time, but I'm getting better. And that's how I know it works, even though I'm generally bad at it. So first of all, how do you spot projections? The telltale signs are usually that they're declarative statements without any attempts at real empathy. Stuff like, "You're so selfish." Yeah, sometimes we are selfish, but a lot of the time this is thrown at someone trying to set a boundary, and the other person is trying to bust it. Therefore, the speaker is the one actually being selfish by trying to bust the boundary. Then there's, "You're judging me." Again, sometimes, yeah, we are. But this one flies out of nowhere into fights sometimes, and it can be really confusing because you weren't actually judging. The other person was judging themselves and projecting onto you. "Stop being angry at me." This one's a double whammy. Anger is a valid emotion. You can't just stop being angry because someone commands you do it. You can handle it in better ways. But anger is one of those emotions that a lot of people don't like admitting they feel because it's a bad thing. So they project it onto other people. Everything is about you, isn't it? Narcissists love to project their own self-centeredness because that's the essential element of narcissism. Other people aren't actually other people with feelings to a narcissist. Everyone is a reflection of themselves, and therefore, everyone else behaves exactly the way the narcissist does, in a completely self-absorbed way. "You're crazy." Anyone who truly believes that someone is struggling with a mental health condition shouldn't be weaponizing that belief. So, "You're crazy" is often a person projecting their own sense that they're losing control onto someone else. And a big button, "You're abusing me." This is a tough one. We need to be aware when we're overdoing things, but emotionally abusive people will use accusations of abuse as part of their pattern of abuse. Boundaries aren't abuse. Getting space when you need it isn't abandonment, and self-care isn't neglect. Occasionally losing your temper doesn't mean you're overall abusive. But some people discover that making an accusation of abuse gets them out of trouble or gets them something they want. Less nefariously, someone with a trauma condition might be triggered and reliving a past trauma overlaying present circumstances. That's a tough one to recognize in yourself. In general, someone defining you by a negative attribute is a projection. We've all gone a little cray-cray at times, but that doesn't mean we're completely divorced from reality. Projections have a tinge of dismissal. They're not dealing with the core of the problem to solve. They're deflections. So now that you've recognized the projection, now what? Top 10 phrase time. Others don't have to like your boundaries, but they do have to respect them. And healthy goals are based on things you can control. When someone's projecting, the first thing to do is set a boundary. I care that you're upset and I want to understand what's wrong, but I won't accept false accusations. If you keep accusing me of things I'm not doing, I'm going to end this conversation. It's very important to be clear what the consequences are going to be for continuing, because that means the other person can't honestly say they were unfairly treated or encountered unexpected consequences. And if the person keeps projecting, you have to enforce the boundary. That's the part I had to work on a lot because I have a ton of empathy and want to soothe other people's hurts. Being lousy at setting boundaries was how I ended up with PTSD, so that had to change. And that's where reminding yourself that healthy goals are based on things you can control comes in. You can't control other people. You can't make them stop engaging in bad behavior. What they're doing to you isn't your fault and you can't fix them. All you can do is be accountable for your own behavior. When someone's projecting, you're dealing with someone who's potentially temporarily delusional. They might not be aware of what they're doing, so they can't be reasoned with. They may wholeheartedly believe that the projection is reality and you're truly doing a terrible thing to them. You can't control that. You may not be able to make them see the error in their thinking. All you can do is get space, let things calm down, and try again. If trying again doesn't work, you may just have to cut your losses. Either way, giving into the projection encourages that behavior. If the other person receives sympathy or soothing when they pull that stunt, you're encouraging them to do it again. You have to make a clear distinction between the person's valid feelings that you care about and are interested in and their poor behavior that you're not willing to tolerate. And that's the part that's hard, because you are going to get painted as the bad guy. Again, you can't control that. You can only control your behavior. Some people will put on the grown-up pants and start dealing with you in a healthier way, but some people never will. You can't save those people from themselves, and there's a high risk that they're going to drag you down with them given enough time and emotional exhaustion. So like I said, this advice is hard to do, but every little bit you can implement gets you closer to being able to deal with those projections without them sticking. And I am way out of time. Thanks for listening to It's Not Therapy. I appreciate you. I am Leanna Kersner. I am not a therapist, and your crazy is only a problem if it's hurting you. See you next time, where we're going to be talking rituals, how they're good for your mental health. Until then, bye-bye.